Welcome to Sydney Ideas, the University of Sydney's flagship Public Talks program. As we begin this evening's event, let's all acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're on today. Here at the University of Sydney, the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And we acknowledge elders, past, present and future. And indeed, we acknowledge traditional owners wherever we're assembling today online. Today's session is about extreme heat and human health, surviving and indeed thriving in a warming world. I'm Tony Capon, Director of the Monash Sustainable Development Institute, and I'm delighted to be hosting the event here tonight. Welcome to all here in the Sydney University campus, the Susan Wakehill building, the School of Health Sciences, and online with us this evening. The event's in two parts. The first part, a conversation with panellists here, and the second part, the Q&A segment. And we encourage you to be thinking about questions for the panellists as we proceed through the event. You'll also have an opportunity to lodge questions online using the slido.com platform. The QR code here, or going directly to slido.com and using the code Sydney Ideas. We also are delighted to have a number of pre-event questions registered, and we'll weave those into the conversation. Worth noting that tonight's event is hosted by the Health Research Incubator here at the university. We're into December, and looking ahead at the Australian summer, we can anticipate a number of extreme heat days across the country. And this has important health impacts. Tonight's event is about understanding those health impacts across the lifespan, and also thinking about sustainable and low-cost solutions in the context of a changing climate. We've got four great panellists here tonight. Sitting next to me, Adrienne Gordon, clinical professor here at the University of Sydney and senior staff specialist at the RPA Centre for Newborn Care. Let's welcome Adrienne. Next to Adrienne, Dr James Smallcombe, research associate here in the School of Health Sciences. And James's research is about increasing human resilience to these extreme heat events. Welcome, James. Next, Ollie Jay. Professor Ollie Jay directs the Heat and Health Research Incubator here at the university, and his research focuses on understanding the physiological and physical factors that determine human heat strain and the risk of heat-related health problems during work and physical activity. Welcome, Ollie. And our final panellist, Dr Georgia Chaseling, who's also a research fellow here in the School of Health Sciences. Georgia's research focuses on the impacts of extreme heat on cardiovascular outcomes among vulnerable people. Welcome, Georgia. So, Ollie, can I invite you to just open up and set the context for this evening's discussion?
Indeed. Thank you very much, Tony. So I think it's firstly important for us to set the scene and really accept that we live in an era of a changing climate. This is backed up by clear scientific evidence, which I'll illustrate in this slide right now. So if we classify the prevailing temperatures that occurred over a 30-year period in the decades between 1951 and 1980, we can categorize those days in terms of being cold, moderate, hot, and extremely hot. Using those definitions for that particular period, and we then apply them to the prevailing climate that occurred between 2005 and 2015, we can see there's a massive shift in the number of days in which we would, using the same criteria, consider hot and also extremely hot. Indeed, by the time we reach the year 2030 to 2035, extremely hot is going to rapidly become the new normal. So why is this a problem? Increases in average temperatures from a human health perspective when we're talking about heat are not what is at issue. What is at issue is the increased frequency, duration, and timing of extreme heat events, heat extremes, or otherwise known as heat waves. There's also chronic hot weather that people have to cope with for prolonged periods of time throughout the year in certain parts of the world, particularly more vulnerable parts of the world, such as lower and middle income countries, where a lot of the products that we consume here in Australia are made. So we can think about the way in which human health and well-being is impacted by extreme heat and hot weather in terms of its impacts across the human lifespan. And it's really important for us to think about it in this context because the nature of those impacts are very, very different depending on what type of person we're looking at and what stage of life they are particularly at. And this is a lot of the work that we're looking at in the Heat and Health Research Incubator here in the Faculty of Medicine and Health at the University of Sydney. So the impacts of extreme heat on human health start even before birth. There's very good, strong epidemiological literature that has described an increased risk of stillbirths and premature deliveries following extreme heat exposure of pregnant women. We don't understand the physiological mechanisms necessarily, but Professor Adrienne Gordon's here on the panel today to talk a little bit more about that context. As we progress into the early stages of life through childhood, we have Dr James Smallcombe, who's working on a National Health and Medical Research Council project grant, which is developing Australia's first evidence-based extreme heat policy for child and youth sport. And we know that the impacts of extreme heat and hot weather on the well-being of children have been quite profound over the past couple of decades. As we then get into adulthood, I'm here to talk with my hat on from the perspective of looking at occupational health conditions. And then as we get into the later stages of life, primary aging, and then the interaction between primary aging and chronic health conditions also serves as a massive risk factor or combination of risk factors for negative health effects of heat extremes and hot weather. And we have Dr. Georgia Chaseling to talk about that, particularly from the perspective of cardiovascular disease. Across the bottom of this particular slide, there's also a variety of other contexts that occur across the human lifespan, which are kind of summarize some of the work that we're doing here in the incubator. We won't have time to talk about them specifically today in the first part of this session, but if any questions arise related to those particular settings, we'd be happy to continue those particular discussions. Another factor that I'd just like to quickly flag is that it's really important that we start to really not just think about extreme heat and hot weather as an individual stressor that's isolated from everything else that we're experiencing here on Earth. There are dual environmental stresses, such as bushfires, and we were reminded of that in the Black Summer of 2019 and 2020. There's also the energy concerns surrounding providing enough electricity to enable people to keep cool using conventional air conditioning units, particularly the most vulnerable who can't afford the prices of energy. And that's particularly pertinent right now as we're experiencing two parallel crises, one associated with energy prices and one associated with the longer-term climate change. And then finally, there's impacts of extreme heat and hot weather in terms of human migration in the future, and also the secondary effects of extreme heat on waterborne disease and vector-borne diseases. And we're starting to do some work in the research incubator here at the University of Sydney looking at some of those particular factors. Now, it's all pretty doom and gloom so far. Indeed, we had one registrant yesterday who submitted a question, and it simply said, "Is there any hope?" So we're here today to make sure that people leave with a semblance of hope. And this is the reason why we've established the Heat and Health Research Incubator here at the University of Sydney. This is a multidisciplinary research centre which is bringing together people from a variety of different disciplines to generate comprehensive solutions to the most complex problems that we face as a function of extreme heat and hot weather, particularly in the context of a changing climate. We're focusing initially in the first 2 years of our existence on 5 priority research themes, which are summarized here on the slide: climate change and health, physical and mental well-being, women's health, built environment and health, and heat and health policy. And below each of those particular categories, there are just a few dot points giving examples of some of the things that we're working on in those particular areas. But that's not an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination. And we're building capacity as we speak, and the people that we have on this panel is testament to that effort in the first year of the incubator. So we're going to be focusing on solutions as well as describing the problems today. And that's, I think, it's a really important factor when we're considering how we're going to address these problems moving forward. And we encourage you to think in that context as well as despairing over the problems, even though they are indeed quite profound. Very finally, I'll just quickly tell you about a very unique facility that we have here at the University of Sydney, which resides on the 9th floor of this beautiful new building that was opened last year. I have the privilege of also being director of the Thermal Ergonomics Laboratory, which houses a state-of-the-art climate chamber, which has been custom built to simulate heat waves of the past, but also of the future, so we can better understand the impacts of different futures based on different climate change scenarios right now, so we can generate evidence to persuade people to act before it's too late. That's all I've got for now. I'll hand over back to Tony. Thank you.
Oh, thanks very much for that terrific overview, Ollie. And let's now explore this a bit further, drill a bit deeper into the specific aspects here. So let me invite Adrienne to tell us a bit about the context of pregnancy and the newborn.
Okay, so I'm privileged to start at the beginning in life and on the panel. And I guess everybody thinks that their area of research interest is the most important, but the beginning of life is the most important, because otherwise none of you are here. So we're interested through the incubator in research involving the impacts of heat on pregnant women and their babies in utero and in the newborn period. So we know globally there are really important outcomes that occur for pregnant women and their babies that are associated with extreme heat. So every 16 seconds globally, a baby is stillborn across the world. 15 million babies are born preterm every year, and that's the biggest cause of death and disability in the under 5 age group. There are other really important factors like being born too small, also hypertension in pregnancy, preeclampsia, and gestational diabetes. And they are different prevalences in different parts of the world. But every one of those key conditions has an association in systematic review data and epidemiological data with extreme heat. So we know that for every 1 degree increase in temperature, for example, the increase of preterm birth and stillbirth goes up by an odds of about 1.05. So that's a 5% increase. And if you think about those numbers, a 5% increase on 15 million is something that we're definitely going to want to try and understand a little bit more about. And one of the interesting things, and what we're trying to do with members of the panel, is to really try and work out why. So particularly for pregnancy, there's a lot of assumed knowledge. There's a lot of things put on pregnant women that they can't do, or they've never been able to do, or they've been restricted from doing. Much of that is not based on true physiological data. So there are concerns about physiological capacity in pregnancy, and there are definitely some things that are true, that you feel hotter when you're pregnant and you generate more temperature. There are 2 people. But there are concerns about things like reduced capacity to sweat, and if you are trying to sweat and you're pregnant, might you direct blood flow away from the placenta to your skin? But a lot of those hypotheses haven't really been tested, and until we get more understanding about that, we won't be able to really inform really good solutions. So I could talk a lot more, but I'm not going to take away from the rest of the panel.
Well, thanks very much for starting us at the beginning there, Adrienne. So next to James to tell us a bit about childhood in this context.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. And like Adrienne, I'm also a little bit biased, but I think children also provide a really interesting population in the context of the issue of heat and health. And not least because there are so many different settings in which children can be exposed to extreme heat. Now, this can start right from the beginning, being pushed around in a pram or a baby stroller during the early years of life, and then we advance into the time when children and adolescents may be participating in structured youth sport on a Saturday afternoon in the heat, Or children even may find themselves in very uncomfortable hot classrooms whilst at school during the summer months. Now, with this in mind, children have often been classified and often assumed to be a vulnerable population in the context of heat. And it's suggested that children are much more likely to experience adverse outcomes when exposed to heat stress. Now, if this is really the case and children are more vulnerable than adults to extreme heat exposure, it poses a number of very interesting questions as to why this might be the case. Now, is it a question of, or is it a case that children may be somewhat physiologically disadvantaged compared to their adult counterparts? Or is it more to do with the way that, or the different ways that children behave in comparison to adults? Now, it might not be as simple as one or the other, and it's likely a combination of these two factors, but these are some of the questions that we're currently trying to tease out here at the University of Sydney. Now, if we just for a moment touch upon some of the possible physiological reasons that a child may be more vulnerable to the heat, it goes without saying that childhood is a period of huge growth, development, and maturation. A child's body changes rapidly during childhood, both in size and shape, and their physiological systems are also still developing. Now, with that in mind, it has been suggested that a child might have a lower capacity to thermoregulate compared with their adult counterparts, and particularly in their ability to sweat. And as we all probably know, sweating is one of the major avenues through which we dissipate body heat as it evaporates from the skin. However, some evidence that's beginning to emerge from our laboratory currently, we're working on a big project that sees children come into our state-of-the-art climate chamber to exercise. It appears that children maybe aren't physiologically disadvantaged compared to their adult counterparts. They seem to be able to sweat just as well, and they seem to be able to dissipate the body heat effectively. So this begs the question whether it is perhaps more of a behavioural issue. And examples of this is, it comes down to this notion of whether children have the cognitive ability to make good decisions when exposed to heat stress. Now, examples of this might be understanding the need to wear less clothing when out and about in hot weather, or reducing the number of layers of clothing. Or it may come down to this, their ability to downregulate the intensity of any given activity that they're performing under heat stress conditions. And it's also probably worth bearing in mind that children are often very heavily dependent on adults to make good decisions on their behalf. So examples of this might include the youth sport coach who has to make the call as to whether the environmental conditions are appropriate for play to continue on a Saturday afternoon, or the teacher that is making the decision as to whether it's safe to send children out to play in the playground during periods of extreme heat. So I think it's this unique combination of these potential physiological differences and these behavioural considerations that make children such an interesting population.
Yeah, no, thanks very much, James. Certainly a lot to explore there, isn't there? Now, Ollie, tell us a bit about the adult context, including work.
Yeah, so thank you, Tony, and thank you, Adrienne and James, for your contributions. So I'll keep it relatively brief because I've spoken quite a lot already, and we want to make sure that we have lots of time for questions. I think the way in which occupational heat stress is evident, it's important for us to think about the context. So if we first look closer to home, what are the impacts of extreme heat on occupational productivity in Australia? There was a paper that was published in Nature Climate Change in 2015 by an international research group, and they estimated that the impact of heat on the Australian economy was north of $6 billion a year. That's with a B. And this was predominantly not through absenteeism, but through presenteeism. And this is a phenomenon where, in order to try to prevent yourself from overheating, if it's an exertional job that you're engaging in, what we tend to do is that we slow down, owing to the fact that we can reduce the amount of heat that we're generating inside the body. And that in and of itself is a behavioral protective measure to overheating. In an office environment, if we start feeling uncomfortable, then we know that that's going to alter the way in which we're going to be productive in an office-based workplace environment. Of course, the solutions maybe focused on things like air conditioning, etc. But I'll talk about that and the issues associated with that a little later on. If we look a little further afield in an international context, particularly in lower and middle income countries, the dynamic changes quite significantly due to the changing nature of labour law settings. So in Australia, we're protected quite relatively well by labour laws which prevent exploitation in the workplace in most cases. In some other countries, this is not necessarily the case, because often people are paid by the unit of productivity, by the bushel, or by whatever output they're generating from that particular job. So if we think about that, and then we think about the way in which we naturally behaviorally defend ourselves against extreme heat in a workplace, then we realize that we'll slow down, we'll get paid less. So then there's this cost-benefit analysis that a lot of people will be doing, is either they slow down, protect themselves against extreme heat, and have to work longer to get paid the same amount, or they try to ignore those signals that their body's giving them to tell them to slow down, and they push forward, and that's when they're exposed to greater risk of maybe not heat stroke, but certainly along the spectrum of exertional heat illness. And there's a lot of great work that is looking at generating some evidence that's supporting that, particularly from my European colleagues, which have been part of the European Heat Shield project, which James was actually a part of before he joined just here at the University of Sydney. Maybe we'll touch on some of that information a little later on. But I think it's that context, or that concept, beg your pardon, of climate justice. The people who are responsible for contributing the most to climate change often don't feel the consequences as much as those who can contribute less. And that's certainly so in an occupational context. I won't talk anymore because I want to allow more time for everyone else to speak. So,
well, thanks very much, Ollie. And I know in the incubator you're doing really interesting work, I think with support from the Wellcome Trust in Bangladeshi garment factories. That's very relevant to this work context. So let's come now to Georgia to tell us a bit about ageing in this context, including cardiovascular disease.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. I think continuing the trend on looking at the negative effects of heat on population wellbeing, I'm interested in looking at the association between extreme heat and ageing and chronic disease as well. Unfortunately, a lot of increase in hospitalizations and mortalities that we see during extreme heat events do occur in adults over the age of 60 years old. And we see about 80% of these deaths are due to cardiovascular risks. People who do have cardiovascular disease are at an extremely increased risk of going to the hospital or, unfortunately, mortality during extreme heat events. And again, continuing the trend of understanding why. We don't really understand the mechanisms that can explain this increased risk. So a lot of the work that I'm interested in doing is trying to understand why these individuals are at a greater risk and what can we do to absolutely protect them from harm during extreme heat events. So I don't think I need to touch on that much more.
Great. Well, look, thanks very much. I think you've given us a good overview of this life course understanding of heat and health. And as Ollie said earlier, we want to now get to the hopeful bit about what are some of those potential solutions, including those sustainable solutions that are lower cost, lower carbon solutions in this context. So perhaps beginning again at the beginning of life, Adrienne, tell us about what we know about solutions in pregnancy and the neonatal period.
Yeah. So I guess the first thing to say is we don't know very much because pregnant women are continually excluded from randomized trials or clinical trials because of the nature of being pregnant. And we've seen that most recently with the COVID pandemic. So I was part of the National Task Force for Living Guidelines for the country for COVID. And, so much evidence coming out every week. No pregnant women included in any clinical trials, tiny percentages, no data on safety, and really didn't get included in all of that work until it was about safety of vaccination. So I guess the first thing to say is if we're going to have solutions for pregnant women, we need to include them in research and we need to include them in clinical trials. We also need to understand, as I said earlier, a little bit more about the unique physiology in pregnancy and what is different and what might not be so different, but we have thought it was. So James and Ollie have led a climate chamber study that was published a little while ago, randomizing pregnant women in the ergonomics lab to different temperatures, and actually found that up to about 32 degrees, there was actually no thermoregulatory impairment. So some of the reasons that we don't include pregnant women in such studies might actually not be true. And now that we've got better ways to understand that, I think that's a really important place to start. I think some of the solutions will come down to things like policy that might affect work habits and culture for pregnancy. In many countries in the world, pregnant women are the workforce, particularly in rural or subsistence areas where they're often doing a lot of the farming. They're doing that right up until they have the baby. They're doing it afterwards with the baby on their back. So there might need to be some very low-cost solutions to actually maintain a workforce, but do that safely. So I think we've got a long way to go, and I think we can follow some of the solutions and work that's happened in other populations. But I think it's a very important population to start including. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Adrienne. And I think that's a really terrific message about this Heat and Health Research Incubator here at the University of Sydney, that it's really challenging some of this received wisdom in our understandings of relationships between heat and human health and the kinds of solutions that we need to be exploring. So James, the context of childhood, what are we learning in that context?
Yes, absolutely. And just before I move on to children, I think it's just worth touching back on the study that Adrienne alluded to there. It was a really interesting study. We got about 20 pregnant women to come and exercise in the climate chamber. And despite them exercising for 45 minutes at a pretty moderate intensity, their rise in core body temperature was no different to non-pregnant women. And importantly, these pregnant women got nowhere near what is thought to be the critical safe threshold for core body temperature. So this, to us, was good evidence that women can safely exercise in the heat, which I think is a very useful finding. Moving on to the context of the pediatric population, similar to the pregnant women, I think the take-home message is there's still quite a lot of work that needs to be done. But the good news is that over the last 2 years, we really have kick-started this line of research in the thermal ergonomics laboratory. As Ollie alluded to, we currently hold an HMRC-funded project, which is designed to systematically examine the thermoregulatory responses of children as they develop through childhood and into adolescence. And the real aim here is to establish whether their thermoregulatory capacity changes with advancing age, and if so, how these responses may differ to those of adults. Now, the big picture kind of side of this project is we hope that these data will help us inform an evidence-based extreme heat policy for youth sport in Australia. Now, we are working on this behind the scenes, and our ultimate hope is that early next year, this will be rolled out in some kind of app form, which end users can log on to, whether it be coaches or parents, select the type of activity the children are likely to be engaging in, and then based on the prevailing environmental conditions at that time, we can provide an overall risk score for youth sport, but also essentially evidence-based strategies that coaches, teachers, children can employ to help keep children both cool and safe during periods of extreme heat. And I'm not sure whether the app is something that Ollie might like to discuss in a little more detail in a slightly different context.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, thanks very much, James. And maybe at this point, just a reminder, here's the Slido QR code, and I can see that questions are coming in, which is great. So thank you very much for that, James. So back to adulthood and that work context. Yeah.
Thank you, Tony. So I'll just briefly touch on two things. And the way we'll categorise them are changes in policy, so work that's been done in that context, and then interventions that can be used in the workplace that don't contribute to the problem further down the line. So first of all, if we focus on policy, now this is not necessarily work that we've done, but good colleagues of ours have done in Europe. And probably the best exemplar of this type of work is some work that's been done by a colleague of ours in our field called Andreas Flores, who's worked in Qatar trying to better characterize the impact of extreme heat on occupational workers in the preparation to the World Cup, which is taking place right now. And obviously that's very well documented, the impacts that has had in terms of worker mortality. And what Andreas' team did, alongside a bunch of other colleagues as well, is that they tried to better understand what the problem was. They then used physiological evidence from people who understand how the human body thermoregulates and implemented that in the context of changes in work policy. And they've got some really strong data demonstrating really quite a dramatic reduction in workplace mortality and morbidity due to extreme heat since the implementation of those policies. And those policies might be something similar as ensuring that there's adequate breaks for recovery of body core temperature, adequate opportunities and supply of hydration. There's some other work from Lars Nebo in Copenhagen, where they've demonstrated that agricultural workers in Europe often arrive at work in a dehydrated state already before they even start work and are exposed to these extreme heat conditions. So the provision of resources that enable people to maintain their thermoregulatory status, it might seem simple, but ensuring that these are embedded in policy is a really powerful way of ensuring that it's translated to changes in health outcomes. And I think that's a really nice example. In fact, some of that work was featured on the cover of Time magazine just before the start of the World Cup. So congratulations to them. In terms of interventions, the one thing I'd like to talk about is this notion, and people who know me will not be surprised that I'm going to talk about this idea of moving air more and chilling it less. We've been quite preoccupied for a long time now thinking that the only way to cool the human body is by reducing the temperature of the air that people are exposed to. But we exchange heat with the environment through a variety of different pathways, and one of them is a process called convection, which is accelerated by air movement. And what it means is that you can lose the same amount of heat, feel pretty much the same thermal status, but with a warmer temperature with a higher airflow. And
just demonstrated by the blinds, actually.
And through a simple intervention such as moving air more with residential fans within an ambient air velocity range which remains comfortable for other reasons, which Professor Richard Didier is here, will be able to talk about that in far more detail than I can and with more authority. But within these ranges of air velocity, what we model is that people can maintain the same thermal experience but at higher temperatures, which means that you can set your thermostat of your air conditioning unit to about 4 degrees Celsius warmer. This means the air conditioning unit will turn on later in the day, it'll turn off earlier in the day. That means it'll be on for a shorter period of time. And some days it might not even be used at all, whereas in still air conditions it would be. And collaborating with our colleagues of sustainability, led by Professor Manfred Lenson and Aranima Malik, we estimated that the reduction in electricity usage and cost for cooling when using this approach, this fan-first cooling approach, saves 70% of electricity use for cooling throughout a typical year here in Australia. So if there's one thing that people can do at the end of this particular talk today, if you go home and throughout the summer, if you use air conditioning, consider turning up that set point by about 3 or 4 degrees and invest in a fan, and you should feel exactly the same, but your bills will be far lower. And that's really important in the context that we're finding with soaring energy prices as well. But that's a solution that can be used in a variety of different contexts, including indoor working environments.
Great. Thanks, Ollie. And clearly, as Ollie points out, in the most recent northern summer, where the governments of Italy and Spain were requiring people to increase the set point of the cooling systems in buildings, this understanding of the importance of moving the air as well as cooling it is really a fundamental understanding that we seem to have lost. I remember when I was a child growing up in Brisbane, nobody had air conditioning and we all used fans. And so, there's been a rapid change of context in Australia, and we seem to have lost this understanding. And the Heat and Health Incubator is trying to reclaim the understanding in part of this work. Georgia, tell us a bit about the ageing context and the solutions that we're finding.
Yeah, absolutely. So it kind of continues on the theme of, air conditioning is quite protective in extreme heat events for any vulnerable populations, but we need to kind of look at ways that we can protect these populations for people who don't have access to air conditioning, who can't afford air conditioning use as well. So one part of my research is, we're trying to understand why older adults and people with cardiovascular disease are at greater risk during extreme heat, but also finding solutions to protect them in the meantime as well. So I've spent quite a lot of years conducting research using the climate chamber here on level 9, where we do simulate heat waves, and we're looking at different cooling strategies that can be used during both hot and humid heat waves and hot and dry heat waves, so we can look at 2 different contexts. So one thing that's important to understand about people over the age of 60 is that they do have a reduced capacity to produce sweat. So this means that they're not able to lose as much heat from their body as someone who's maybe between 18 to 40 years old. So one strategy that you can look at is something as simple as putting cold water on your skin. That can help you, once you evaporate that water, can help you to lose heat from the body. But fan use is quite beneficial in the context of extreme heat, especially in very humid heat waves where you are producing a lot of sweat. It's going to help that sweat to evaporate from your body and help you to lose heat. And then even combining skin wetting with fan use, but extending that to just things like going to a swimming pool or having a cold shower, getting a sponge and dabbing yourself with cold water. These are all very simple strategies that are low cost, consume no carbon or very minimal if you use a fan, very economical for a lot of populations as well. So that's a lot of the research that we're doing. And again, just to follow on what Adrienne was saying before, a lot of research doesn't include pregnant women, but a lot of research doesn't include people with cardiovascular disease because people are so concerned just to, think about exposing these people to the heat with fear of what might happen. We know that there's an increased cardiovascular strain. The heart has to work a lot harder when we're exposed to a hot environment, but it's understanding how hard does the heart work and how much heat is too much heat before we start to see some negative effects. And that's some of the work that myself with Ollie and the Heat and Health Research Incubator are trying to understand as well.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Georgia. So now it's over to you. In the room here, an opportunity for Q&A with the panel and also online. I can see a number of online questions. I can see one hand up in the room. Let's start here and then others in the room, or we'll go online next. Yeah.
I went to a lecture with the chief scientist body towards nature, smart, livable cities. Now that was talking about greening cities to keep them cooler, using the plant's transpiration to take excess heat off. My other comment really is, with the last floods and warmer weather, we're getting tropical diseases right down to Victoria. Do you think we're going to end up with tropical diseases right throughout the east coast of Australia?
Great. Well, thanks very much for those reflections. I might pass perhaps to Ollie in that urban context, because I know you are doing work at different scales.
That's right.
And also for the second one around mosquitoes, you just recently won a really interesting grant.
Sure.
From
Yeah.
MRC,
So I can briefly touch on that. Predominantly the first comment. So thank you for that. So there are a variety of different levels at which we can introduce interventions, and we actually recently described this in a series of papers that we published in the journal called The Lancet, and there's a few copies are lying around that we'd be able to distribute to anybody that's interested in. So the way that we described it is that there's something called the heat cascade. So the reason that we ultimately get hot, whether we're outdoors or indoors, is due to the transfer of heat from the environment down to the individual. So if we think about us in this room right now, if it was 45 degrees Celsius and very humid outside, the reason that we would get hot is because of a failure to intervene at the landscape level, which is what you're describing, at the building level, and then at the individual level. Now, I'll start at the landscape level, because I think that's what's probably most pertinent to your comment, is that one thing that we can do is to reduce something called the urban heat island effect, which is essentially an increase in ambient temperatures in densely urbanized areas owing to the features of the built environment and the landscape environment. Heat retention from things like concrete, heat generation from things like cars, from air conditioning units, et cetera, et cetera. So it's thinking about ways in which we can reduce that generation of heat and retention of heat. And one of the main ways in which we could do it at the landscape level is increasing something called green infrastructure, which is more greening, more parks. The central building down there has greenery on its walls and on its roof, I believe. And that is owing to that process that you're describing, something called evapotranspiration, which is exactly the same way that humans keep cool, is by having moisture on the skin surface, its evaporation, and it liberates latent heat with it. So that's why greening works. Very briefly, at the built environment level, we can increase insulation of buildings. We can increase the reflectivity of buildings to try to slow down the transfer of environmental heat that's outside to the interior of the built environment. But in some settings, particularly in low-income housing, which are predominantly constructed of low thermal performance materials, that fails. So we're left at what can we do at the individual level? And that's really what Georgia's work is informing a lot of. The question is, what should we be telling people to do to mitigate the physiological strain that evolves during extreme heat exposure, which is ultimately responsible for making people ill and in some cases killing them? The cardiovascular strain, the thermal strain, and the dehydration. And it's important that we look at these interventions thinking about it in a low resource context, because the most vulnerable can't afford the latest ice vest. They can't afford the latest gadget. We've got to think about things that people can do right now with the resources that they have to them right now. And if that means, in many cases, that means simply using water, potentially. In some cases, they won't even have clean water. So what can you do with unclean water to keep cool without having to drink it? That's something that we're looking at. Very briefly, I'll just touch on the mosquito-borne disease question. The deputy director of the Thermal Ergonomics Laboratory, Dr. Georgi Mavros, is just, this is under embargo, so I can't really say too much about it. If we keep it inside here, I think it'd be all good. We just received a very nice grant led by Georgi, and so James is a chief investigator on that particular grant as well, which is looking at this in the context of trying to reduce the risk of mosquito-borne diseases in settings where people acquire those diseases due to mosquito bites overnight. And the number one way in which we try to prevent that is by having insecticide-treated mosquito nets. But the number one barrier to overnight net use compliance is feeling too hot. So the question is, what can we do to that? The interior of that mosquito net environment, moving air, is one of the things that we're looking at, to try to improve sleep quality, improve overnight net use compliance. Once we understand that context, that's what we're trying to understand, the parameters of that, and trying to scale that up to a field setting, which we can actually demonstrate that these interventions can not just reduce the direct impacts of heat, but also the secondary impacts in the form of mosquito-borne diseases in that context.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting work. We won't talk about who the funder of that one
No,
might be, because, but
maybe
potentially, very relevant to the control of malaria, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa. So thanks for that, Ollie. I might go to one of the questions from the pre-registration questions. There's one here, I think, for Adrienne. As a clinician, what are pregnant women concerned about when they're thinking about hot weather and heat extremes?
So we get questions around, can I go in a spa? That's a common question. and can I continue to exercise when pregnant? So I think for the first one about going in a spa or not, a lot of that, advice and temperature is based on older studies. Some of them are from animal herds, like cows, and looking at heat as a teratogen in cows, not in pregnant humans. And some of that data also comes from like maternal fever studies, so things like the Spanish flu and getting hot at different parts of pregnancy and whether that leads to miscarriage or not. So I guess to answer the question, if you're in hot water, does it actually make you hot? And I guess we do have some data to say it probably doesn't make you as hot as you think. The best way to cool yourself down is to get in water, unless it's super, super hot. It's the best way to actually cool yourself down. So some of that might well be an urban myth. Not that I'm going to tell everybody to go and get in a spa, but I think some of it is based on flawed evidence. And the exercise one I think is very interesting. So if you are a very fit pregnant woman, then the worst thing you could do is stop exercising in pregnancy. So if you have that physiological capacity, being pregnant shouldn't really change that. And we know that if you look at cohort studies or just routine data in pregnancy, people exercise far too little in pregnancy. And so some of these criteria that happen, I guess, are based on not great evidence. So I guess we'd say if you're fit, continue to exercise, don't stop. If you don't exercise at all, then you might want to do some exercise in pregnancy, but you're not going to suddenly take up running the 10K if you've never done any exercise before. Yeah.
Great.
Do you think it's also perhaps it comes down to employing a little bit of common sense in terms of when you choose to exercise? Maybe you don't exercise in the peak hours of the
course.
day.
Yeah.
Maybe thinking about how long you're going to exercise for. Maybe half an hour, 45 minutes will do the job. You don't need to push it on for much longer. Just employing a little bit of common sense perhaps also.
I think common sense is very important, but often lacking.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Here I think also online, an important question about differentiating between extreme heat when it's humid and extreme heat when it's dry. Georgia, would you like to say something about that and its importance?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is a difference between what we call a very hot and humid heat wave and a very hot and dry heat wave. So I feel like more so lately in Sydney it's been quite humid, but typically in Australia, in the east here, we do experience dry heat waves. So that's when there's very low relative humidity. Up North Queensland and in North America, they experience quite hot and humid heat waves. So in hot and dry heat waves, from a physiological perspective, a lot of the sweat that is secreted onto the skin surface evaporates. And so our body almost struggles to continue to sweat to allow us to lose heat from the body. So this can cause dehydration problems and increases our core temperature. So we have increased heart rate and cardiovascular strain. From a humid perspective, a lot of the sweat that's on the skin, if you start to notice it dripping off of your body, it's not evaporating. So it's not actually contributing to heat loss from the body. So in that situation, we need to try and figure out ways to increase the evaporation of sweat onto the skin surface. And that's where using things like fans or increasing airflow onto the body are going to be really beneficial to help keep us cool. So the different heat waves influence our body different ways. Hot, dry, we want to look at getting as much water on the skin as possible. Where hot, humid, we want to look at trying to get the sweat off the skin as much as possible effectively. So, yeah.
Great. Thanks. Thanks very much, Georgia. I think we've got another question from the room up the back.
Yes, thank you for the interesting introductions. I've a plea to Ollie and a question to James. Ollie, you are...
Stop talking, is it?
No. Your information on the air conditioning and the moving air and the temperature that you feel when the air is moving, that feels 4 degrees better. Can you please spread that message wherever you have a chance, and let us to Westfield especially, and to all restaurants, and because wherever you enter in summer, it is freezing cold, and that costs a lot of extra energy. Then my question to James: as parents, we had a common understanding, and it might be wrong, that kids develop easier fever and higher fever. If that is correct, is there any link to what heat does with their bodies?
Yeah, so although that's addressed as a question to me, I wonder if Adrienne might be slightly better placed from a clinical perspective to comment on that.
Yeah. So I think they don't get a higher fever, but they have a more rapid increase from a normal temperature to a high temperature. And they also have, I guess, a greater susceptibility to things associated with fever, like febrile convulsions, for example. So much more common for that to cause a problem when you're in the preschool age group than when you're, over about the age of sort of 7 or 8. So, but I don't think there's data to say that the actual temperature you get is higher. I think it's more the rise to get there that's higher. Yeah.
Great, thanks. And Ollie, would you like to respond to the first question as well?
Maybe ask James to reflect a little bit on some of the factors that could render young kids more susceptible to overheating, not in a fever context necessarily, but in a physical active, just in terms of the body size and things like that.
Yeah, sure. So I alluded to some of this when I spoke to you earlier. And there's this kind of dilemma, whether it's a physiological difference that perhaps exists between adults and children, or whether it's behavioral. But if we think about some of the physiology that's going on during childhood, as we said, adults and children are very different. A very obvious way in which they differ is their body size. And this is both their body surface area and their body mass. And this combination, of the interaction between these two factors, is relevant from a body heat storage perspective. Now, when we're younger, we tend to have a larger body surface area, but a lower body mass. And in terms of from a heat balance perspective, this can be disadvantageous for children, especially when ambient temperature exceeds skin temperature. So once we get past around the 35 degrees Celsius mark, what that additional body surface area to mass ratio can essentially accelerate is the amount of heat that's blown on to a child's skin, potentially accelerating the rate at which they heat up.
With that said, what I'll just quickly say is, so we've got an honours student, Megan Tiong. He's writing an excellent paper at the moment that's really trying to model the ways in which different surface area to mass ratios actually matter. And another key consideration is whether there's parallel reductions in the ability to sweat. So if you've got those two things happening at once, higher surface area to mass ratio and a reduction in the ability to sweat, then that's where it becomes really quite problematic.
But as I also mentioned earlier, the evidence that's emerging from a lab suggests that children can sweat.
Indeed.
They do have the ability to sweat, and it's very similar to that ability of adults. So we don't think there's a problem from that perspective.
Great. Well, thanks very much. Now, just doing a bit of a time check. I think we've got 6 or 7 minutes left. I think we've got another question in the room, and there's one more up the back as well. We might have to have some of the questions just casually at the end, but let's go over here first and then up the back and see how we go time-wise. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. My question's towards Adrienne. So I was wondering concerning pregnant women, what the next stop would be in a next step within the incubator research you're doing. So is it, are you also, for example, going to look at if there's some fetal stress associated with increased heat or other pathways like, that mothers are more prone to pregnancy complications like gestational diabetes and hypertension, and through that could be a mechanism. Or I'm wondering even through sleep, for example, right, that pregnant women during hot nights might not sleep as well, and there could be something going on. Or is it all limited towards the physiology within the mother directly in that sense? So, yeah.
Excellent question. Anyone from the Wellcome Trust listening?
Maybe. Hi, if you are.
Well, we have applied for a grant to try and answer some of these questions, which has a field study in 2 different countries, working with colleagues from the University of Sydney, the Sigaratam Institute in New Delhi, and the Public Health Foundation of India. And those 2 field studies would be done in quite different populations. One a rural, low-income population with a lot of subsistence farming, and one a sort of low to middle-income urban setting. and a climate chamber study here in Sydney, where we would look at maternal heat strain and fetal strain. So we would do that by fetal heart rate and some Doppler studies looking at placental blood flow. And there are a number of new products to look remotely at fetal heart rate that I guess may or may not be ready or not under patent, or if we were lucky enough to get funded. But they're actually, there's, I can show you this great paper published last week from the Gambia, 6th of December, very similar to some of the work we're trying to do, but obviously quite a different field setting. And I think there will need to be a lot of these studies to complement to complement each other, because the experiences of pregnant women by occupation and by the temperatures and heat stress they're exposed to is really different in all those populations. So hopefully we'll have the ability to answer some of those questions. Yeah.
Great. Thanks very much, Adrienne. I think there was one more question up the back.
Oh, yeah. Thanks. It's all extremely relevant and important stuff you're telling us. I was curious if, I know you're doing all the international research, if you had looked at populations around, like, say, Saudi Arabia and Dubai, who historically have lived with really high temperatures and obviously probably low levels of foliage in the environment. They look like they cover their bodies quite a lot, so I'm not sure how that affects evapotranspiration on the skin. If that has informed anything of your understanding about habits, cultural habits, maybe siestas, how active we are at different parts of the day, and how they as populations have coped before sort of having this wealth of oil and obviously cranking up the air conditioning. If that's had any research done into it as well.
Sure. Maybe I'll quickly take this. It's a great point. So I think one thing that we shouldn't get too preoccupied with is just temperature, though. So those type of environments that you're describing have very high ambient temperatures, and they're measured in the shade as well. That's another take-home point for everybody, is that the temperatures that we see are measured in the shade, not in the sun. They're typically 15 to 17 degrees Celsius higher in the sun. But the humidity is very low. So under those particular conditions, the ability to evaporate sweat is unimpaired by the climate, but the impairments comes from the body, as Georgia described, so the ability to secrete sweat. I think the behavioral component is a really important and interesting question, and I actually was reflecting on this past week, thinking about a longer-term research project, and really trying to acquire as much information from traditional sources where people have existed for thousands of years in certain parts of the world without any mechanical intervention, such as air conditioning, for example. Clearly, this has been possible, and documenting this and leveraging this traditional knowledge to inform contemporary policy, I think that's a really important consideration. And another thing that Tony and I have talked about in the past is also the role that certain cultural norms play into this whole situation as well. You know, just looking at people clad in business suits in Singapore, for example, and it's 36 degrees Celsius and 75% humidity, and they're wearing all this clothing because it's the cultural expectation is to be wearing this business suit if you work for HSBC or whoever it is. Trying to think about ways in which we can modify the personal factors, what people are doing and what they're wearing, to rely less on these carbon-intensive cooling strategies such as air conditioning. I think there's lots of work to be done, and it also demonstrates why we need the input of very different levels of expertise or different types of expertise. This is why we're seeking not just to work with clinicians and physiologists, but we're seeking to work with social scientists and people who can, even historians, who can understand this information better and help us synthesize it to make it useful moving forward.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Ollie. I think that's a great way to finish the Q&A segment. Let's thank everybody for that. Now, just as we close, I might invite the panellists to say one final message, like a takeaway message, if you like, from tonight's discussion that potentially might be useful here in Sydney and around Australia in the coming summer. So what would the takeaway message be? Where should we start?
Start at that end, so Adrienne can figure one out. I recognise that look.
I actually thought about this earlier this afternoon because I was thinking about a lot of the topics that we were talking about, and I feel like it's a lot of doom and gloom. Like, you know, heat is bad, people are dying, people are going to hospital, and I was kind of thinking about, like, you know, you get presented with such a big problem, but, you know, we as humans have to adapt. Like, it's only going to get warmer, and we need to learn to not run from our problem. We need to adapt to this problem and build resilience within our community. So as much as there are negative impacts associated with heat exposure, I think the work that the Heat and Health Research Incubator is doing to try and find solutions is so important. But I think as a community and as a population, as we move forward and we work together and as we adapt, I feel like it's not as doom and gloom as we might present it to be at some point. So that would be my take-home message.
Great. Thanks very much, Georgia. Ollie?
Increase your air conditioning set point by 4 degrees Celsius and move the air.
Great. Thanks very much, James.
I guess just a quick one for me in terms of the work that I'm doing with the children is that we're not trying to put children off being physically active in the heat. We're just trying to build a good, strong evidence base with which we can protect them, keep them cool, keep them safe, so they can continue what they're doing into the future.
Great. And Adrienne?
I think the last thing is collaboration. I think these are really big problems, and they require lots of different people, lots of different organisations to help solve them. And I think that's what the Heat and Health Incubator is trying to do.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Adrienne. I do note that there were quite a lot of great questions online, and maybe we encourage the organisers to send them through to the incubator, because I'm sure we could have some more dialogue.
And we're also happy to stick around for a little, unless Adrienne falls asleep. I don't know, you've been up for like 28 hours. But yeah, happy to field any questions.
Yeah, so for people in the room, hang around. And for those online questions that we didn't get to, I'm sure the incubator will be happy to respond to them via email as well. So let's thank our panellists once again.